So glad to have you on the Be Love podcast today, Elliott, and to talk with you about love. I know your interests are many and varied. I'm really interested to hear about some of your insights and experience as a teacher and an academic studying Islam, and which is another tradition of love. And of course, you and I have a shared connection in the Swedenborgian Church as one other community seeking to do this work of loving each other. And I open up this space to just hear people's personal journeys, what you've learned along the way, and how love has called you. I wonder if you might start. You've shared a bit with me about your grandmother. Maybe you could start by giving us a little picture of her, because I know she really was the person who grounded you early on in the Swedenborgian tradition. What can you tell us about her?
Yeah, I feel like my grandmother speaks volumes to the person that I've become and where I am. And she always described herself as atheist agnostic.
Interesting.
I started college when I was 18, and I took a world religions class my first semester of college. And then right before college, I had worked at a cafe and I had worked with some Muslims. So aside from Swedenborgian folks that I spent time with as a teenager, these Muslims that I worked with at the cafe was one of my first interactions with what we might call like organized religion, and which was something that I found slightly annoying. And my cousins were raised Catholic. And so when we had to go to church at their house, we were all grumpy about it because we couldn't play video games on Sunday mornings. And so, but yeah, going to the Swedenborgian retreats, I don't know that I thought of it as like organized religion per se, because it felt so organic. It felt like extended family, something my sister had been involved with. She had gone to retreats. It's something I'd grown up with hearing my grandmother talk. And so it was just kind of in the background as another social community that I knew about. And I got to learn more and more about it as I grew older. And so I had a lot of fun conversations with my grandmother about religion when I converted to Islam, just around issues of atheism and agnosticism. And she said, well, I'm atheist. And then we talk about it and I'd be like, well, it kind of sounds like you're agnostic. And so I had fun discussing like vocabulary with her and stuff like that. And she's like, well, at the end of the day, it's just a mystery, and who even knows? And so,
well, that's my question. I want to ask, like, how did her identity or connection to Swedenborgianism blend with being agnostic and atheist? How did you understand that soup of identity?
Yeah, it continues to be really funny, and I think emblematic on how, people relate to religion and spirituality in general, is that people don't fit into neat little boxes. And I think as a teacher as well, working with young people, just the more and more you learn about the details of people's backgrounds and spiritual lives, you can see that things are multifaceted and are not always what meets the eye. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think at the end of the day, it's made me less of a judgmental person. And my grandmother was always a big influence in that regard as well. She was just one of the most accepting, kind people who would be interested in people regardless of their backgrounds, and that made a really big influence on me. And yeah, she had been involved in the Swedenborgian Church since she was a teenager. She met a man who became a mentor of hers, and it was really the community and going to community events and retreats that made a really big impression on her. And so she was part of various boards, and a lot of her friends were Swedenborgian. And so so I grew up with this kind of funny tension of my atheist agnostic grandmother who belongs to a church. And
I love it. And honestly, it sounds very familiar to me. I feel like the organization of the Swedenborgian Church, while it carries this deep theology and this big mystical vision, some of the ethics of the community are, you can believe whatever you want, and that it's much more about living a life of kindness, which sounds like what she she lived, and all of these
Mm-hmm.
labels or markers of identity are less important. And yet it's a denomination that has boards and buildings, and it sounds like she was actively involved in that part. I'm guessing she's not the only atheist agnostic Swedenborgian that ever was. So
Sure.
that's a
Yeah.
whole.
And so my sister went to Swedenborgian retreats as a
Mhm,
teenager, and so she encouraged. She always had nice things to say, and she's like,
mhm,
you should go to Elliott. And one of the advantages of my grandmother being on boards is that I was able to get funding. And so that
sure.
wasn't an issue. And so I was like,
Mhm,
sure, why not? And yeah, it was one of the first times in my life where I was surrounded by people where I felt really accepted,
yeah.
and that people would, of course, tease each other as friends do, but it was all
Yeah.
in good fun, as
Yeah.
opposed to like being in high school where people would tease you, but they'd be kind of jerks
So,
about it. And so
mhm,
it was almost like a shock to my system being around this group of people. They were teasing each other in lighthearted ways, and I was sort of waiting for the jabs, but it was really just kindness, and that made a really big impression on me. And so I think
same.
when I met these Muslims in high school, I sort of started connecting the dots in the sense
Mhm,
of people can come from all sorts of different streams of spirituality and have different levels of judgment and non judgment, and still have kindness as some kind of underlying value that transcends all sorts of things. And so it was easy for you to make connections. And then just to
yeah.
tie things together with both of these traditions, as I, sort of engaged in the contemplative sides of things and would meditate and do different types of. I remember my grandmother wanted to practice hypnosis on me one time that she had
Oh, wow.
learned, and I was like, sure, hypnotize me. And it was something like a guided meditation, for lack of a
Sure.
better word. And so, yeah, so this common denominator of love is just what struck
Mhm,
me, and
mhm,
that really formed the basis of how I thought about religion from that point on. And then when
mhm,
I took a world religions class in college and decided to major in religious studies until I found something useful and marketable, which fortunately it's worked out.
mhm,
And now I've been a professor for the past 13 years, and it's pretty much my dream job. I live in upstate New York, and most of my family lives in California, so that's hard. I have a 10 and 13-year-old who live with me half
mhm,
time, and their mom lives about 15 minutes away, so
mhm,
they're my family that lives nearby. But just sort of like we're doing right now, and I
mhm.
think, especially since COVID, I've learned to appreciate the power of virtual connections,
Yeah.
which aren't the same as in person, but it's still worth a lot.
Yeah.
It can still set the stage and keep people connected, so that when we are in person, it kind of feels like, no time has passed, and it's just like,
Sure.
here we are, like we've always been.
Yeah. Yeah. At this point in your life, do you have communities or circles that have that same sense of kind of generous ribbing and loving connection? Do you have that within your academic community? Are you still practicing Islam? Or are you primarily teaching it?
I am. I would
Yeah.
say it's like I'm 42. I converted to
Mhm.
Islam when I was 18,
Okay.
became sort of interested and engaged in various practices when I was 16. So
Okay.
it's definitely been part of my life for a long time. I would
Mm.
say, like many traditions or people you talk to that participate in religious or spiritual traditions go through all sorts of evolutions. And
Yes.
so that's certainly been my experience, where I've I've developed and thought about things differently. I converted when I was in California. It was mostly around a white convert community, and then when I graduated from college and went to grad school, then I eventually started going to abroad to study Arabic. And so I've spent something like a little over 2 years living abroad in various countries studying Arabic. I was in Morocco for a year. I spent summers in Yemen,
Mm-hmm.
and I 6 months each in Cairo and Damascus. And
Wow.
then I
Mm-hmm.
traveled around various countries in the Middle East as well. I took students on a study abroad trip a few years ago to Tunisia. And I also went to a conference for a couple weeks in Indonesia about 10 years ago. And fun fact that many people don't know is that Indonesia is the largest or is the most populous Muslim majority country in the world.
Wow.
And so,
No,
yeah,
I didn't know that.
something we don't hear about much on the news.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
another fun fact is that there's more Muslims in China than there are in Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
So yeah, so one of the things my studies and my travels have impressed on me is just that the world is such a big place, and that whatever we might think we know about a given tradition, we just know a little slice of the pie. And
Right.
so it's been really fun and liberating to realize that I don't know that much, but it also helps me take things with a grain of salt when people want to get on their high horse and, tell me like the meaning of a given
Sure.
religion, even
Right.
though I know they're just giving me a slice of the pie.
Right. In all your taste of the pie, have there been some consistent themes around how Islamic community shows up around the planet? Anything that stays the same in all these different environments that is meaningful to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a certain sense, like a lot of things when you belong to, I mean, I guess I would say, especially as like a white convert who studies Arabic, um, you know, I sort of fulfill a niche role in the world
Hmm.
in that regard. I would
Hmm.
say in general it's been very sweet is that on the whole people are like very excited that like this white guy is speaking Arabic and is interested in their culture,
Hmm.
especially in a world full of racism and post 9/11 and hate crimes and Islamophobia, and the
Hmm.
current administration of the United
Hmm.
States is making that worse. And so I would say one of the things that has been really, really cool and heartening is that, and when I first started going abroad, I didn't necessarily know what to expect, but by and large, what I found is that across the board, people are like, you're not your government. We're
Right.
so happy that you're here to learn about our culture and speak our
Hmm.
language. And that's so
Hmm.
cool. And
Hmm.
I'm critical of the government too. So
Yeah.
it's easy to connect to people on how much we dislike American foreign policy.
Sure.
And and just
Hmm.
yeah, and just having sort of cultural exchanges about what family life is and religious life, and
Hmm.
learning about the different cultures that I'm in. I find that it's really easy to connect with people. And I would say one more thing. My oldest daughter was 6 months old. My former wife got a Fulbright scholarship to go to Morocco. And I was writing my doctoral dissertation, so I could be anywhere in the world. And Morocco seemed like a fine place to go. And so we went with our 6 month old kid. And sometimes people are like, was that hard bringing a 6 month old to
Right.
Morocco? And it was totally the opposite. Having a small child, people are just like so much extra friendly. And if I'm going to generalize it, Morocco is just a culture where people just love kids and are, will just walk up to you and grab your kid and carry it around. And it's
Yeah.
culturally acceptable.
Hmm.
It took a
Hmm.
little getting used to because it's like,
Sure.
wait a minute, you're just
Where are you
taking my
going?
kid.
Yeah.
But but
Yeah.
ultimately I understood that it was just very sweet and it was part of the culture. Oftentimes we got special treatment for having a small child. So my
Yeah.
overall experience of being a foreigner traveling in Arabic speaking countries was just that people are just happy that someone like me is there to learn about their culture and learn their language. And
Yeah.
obviously, like, sincere because Arabic's not an easy language to learn. And so people are, yeah, just like generally impressed and happy that I'm engaging with that part of their culture. So I've had an overwhelmingly positive and sweet experience traveling the world in that regard.
Yeah. And Arabic is a sacred language too. Even with people all over the country, it's the central language in how Islam is experienced, right? It's how the Quran is read. So even in China, are people speaking Arabic?
Yeah, I mean it definitely is a transcultural language in that regard. People there's formal Arabic and then there's dialects. And so what I'm mostly trained in is formal Arabic, which kind of sound so formal Arabic is no one's native language. And
Ah,
so
sort of.
and
Yeah.
so but it is the language of like literature and if you're giving speeches or formal types of things. And so
Hmm.
when I speak formal language to people, they like kind of think it's cute. It's like it's like okay. And so especially if people are educated, they'll entertain
Hmm.
me and they'll speak with me in formal language.
Interesting.
When I was living in Cairo and Damascus, since I had a longer extended time there, I was able to pick up a little bit more on the dialects, and so blend in a little bit more.
Sure.
But
Sure.
um, yeah, it was still certainly a challenge. But I think people appreciated the effort.
There's an openness and appreciation that you're trying it all. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is it when you as a young college student, do you have a recollection of what called you to convert? What drew you to that community? Was it the people? Was there something about the practice or theology of Islam that drew you?
Yeah, it was kind of like a perfect storm of all sorts of things. I went to high school in the boondocks in Northern California,
Mhm.
in the country. My neighbors were pig farmers. Nothing against pig farmers, but just to give you a sense of the kind of culture I went to high school in. And my graduating class was like 90 people. And so I think it's fair to say that I went to a semi insular high school.
Mhm.
Yeah, I worked at a cafe that was about a half an hour away from my high school. And that's where I met these really lovely people at the work that I was at. And one of the things that impressed me about them was that they were very much not preachy. And so any conversations we were having were just organic. There was these three people who were all formative in different ways, and they had independently moved from the East Coast to the West Coast in Northern California to live at this retreat center, which was a Sufi spiritual retreat center. And Sufism is often described as like the mystical branch of Islam.
Yeah.
The more I've learned about religion and spirituality, the more connections I've found between Sufism and Swedenborgianism, in the
Mhm.
sense that both traditions are interested in looking at inner meanings of things,
Yeah.
and that it doesn't make the outer things unimportant, but it means that the inner realities are the focus.
Yeah.
And on the whole, I find that those types of orientations make people more open minded and less
Mhm.
judgmental. And so that was really my cup of tea. At this retreat center, they had these chanting and meditation rituals that
Mm.
I would go to because, I had these friends that I worked with and they invited me, and I was sort of open to all sorts of things that would make my high school experience more tolerable. These chanting meditation rituals ended up being really powerful. We would
Mhm.
often do them in groups, but these
Mhm.
were also practices that I could do on my own. And
Mhm.
so I found that the more I practiced these things on my own, it sort of it just sort of made me more in touch with my heart and gave me peace. And then also just sort of like little things started happening in my life that seemed to like line up, like this
Mm-hmm.
was sort of like the right, like signs from the universe, I guess you could say.
Was the path for you. Yeah. Well, with the hopes of getting to the end of this interview after all of these technological glitches, I wondered if maybe you could share one of these spiritual practices that you have learned that you use that you find useful to coming back to the center, coming back to the moment, coming back to what's real.
Hmm.
Is there one that I know this summer I loved what you offered at Almont with the repeating of Allah many times. Is there a shorter one that you sometimes use just to kind of ground yourself in the midst of your day?
I mean, that's a practice that you can extend for hours or for moments because it's just saying this word Allah. Sometimes people could say it in like a moment of frustration, like Allah, like I stubbed my toe, or it can be more of a chant to get into a trance of like Allah, Allah. And that can be done in unison or that can be done on your own. And then a fun fact that a lot of people don't know, which I think I shared at camp, was that in Aramaic, one of the names that Jesus would have used for God is Allah. And since Arabic and Aramaic are both Semitic languages, that makes sense. And then in Hebrew, you have Elohim, which is also cognate and has equivalent Hebrew letters. And so sometimes explaining that to people can help disarm whatever prejudices they have or not. But you can't argue with historical linguistics because they've been around a lot longer than we have.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting to me the way words, like the word for God, the name for God, can unify us. So we can say
Hmm.
together and it connects the two of us. It connects us to, every being that's ever walked the planet that has spoken that word and longed for that connection. And those words can cause us to feel separate because we might have different words for God and we might have assumptions about what those words mean. I'm continually reflecting lately on words and their power to unite and also to separate, which maybe brings us to this aspect of the mystical branches of religion.
Hmm.
I have the sense that it is the mystical branches that unite us, where we kind of can see some common ground amongst different traditions. Is that your perception that it's the mystical element that brings unity, or what is the mystical element of a religion to you?
For sure. I think that's one of the things that got me into religion and spirituality in the first place was that I was doing these meditation practices and just sort of like seeing what comes up. And one of the things that came up was, these very primordial, ancient experiences that were reminiscent of just like being a child and remembering what it was like to be surrounded by love and my family and my grandmother who I mentioned and my mom, and it wasn't intentional, and so it was kind of just like a cool revelation to have that I was engaging in what was on one level like a new spiritual practice, but it connected to something deeply familiar, and that remains the case. And so, yeah, to your point of, if we're defining mysticism as something that's like transcendent, that unites people, that's been my experience. The love that we, obviously not everyone has the same types of loving childhoods. And so I feel very lucky and fortunate in that regard. But it's been a touchstone for me, and yeah, like a real source of gratitude and blessing as I try to navigate all the different ways people try to talk about God and assert who's right and who's wrong. And I feel like in many places there's this common touchstone of love and our own experiences of love, and that there's some sort of commonality about it that humans can relate to.
So the chanting almost creates like a lulling or a, and I think of even people who maybe didn't have a loving childhood. Hopefully everybody has like had the experience of being fed or of sleep or of feeling the breeze, or that there is some element of just connection to the universe, that
Mm-hmm.
just by being alive we all are given that sense of connection. And if we're still here on the planet, we have been fed. I mean, something has been sustaining us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the mystical element, and then there's the practices of religion. And so for me, communion feels like on a deeper level, it is a very mystical practice of just eating. And that's something that's such a universal need. And it does speak to a oneness. It does speak to a let us all come and eat. And in practice, denominations have said certain people are, you have to do certain things to come to the table. But it doesn't seem as if that was necessarily Jesus's intention at the beginning of the process. And what's your read on that as a student of religion? It does seem to me that the founders of these great religions, were kind of the original mystics who had a unitive experience, who felt a call, a connection to God, to the one, and then sought to communicate that to others. Um, I don't know. I certainly wonder, like, if you were there at the time, it seems like everybody would be welcome to hear the message, that there was an intention of drawing us towards unity. But then there's sort of, it gets overlaid with everybody come be like me. How does that play out in your experience of your learning about Islam, especially?
I think there's two things that come to mind. One is you hear people say something like, I love Jesus. It's just his followers that I have a problem with. And so I think there's this sort of perennial idea that, you can have foundational ideals and then you can count on humans to screw it up. And, with arrogance and just all the things that humans do. On the flip side, part of my experience of just traveling the world is that there's beautiful, kind-hearted people everywhere you go. So hopefully we develop some kind of discernment to, figure out who's on team compassion and team love and who's, on some other team. So there's a Sufi saying, so in the mystical tradition of Islam, that in the beginning Sufism used to be a reality without a name, and then it became a name without a reality. And so one of the ideas is, to your point, is that, so the story goes that, like, in the early days of the Prophet Muhammad and his communities, there was just this spirituality that permeated everything, and it didn't need to be called anything per se because it was just there and people were feeling the vibes. And then as time went on and, people just became more self-absorbed and tried to over-intellectualize things, etc., then it became more important to name these practices that bring us back to the source and the love and the divine unity. But there's a paradox built into that as well, because then that relates to power grabs in terms of, like, whose version of bringing us back to the one is correct. And then, of course, that's how different, like, sects and denominations can evolve. And, that permeates human history. But I like to think there's some kind of nameless, underlying transcendent reality that we have access to. But that's the challenge, is how do you point to that reality if you can't talk about it, or if talking about it entails a certain amount of, like, I'm right and I know how to talk about it and you don't. And that's, yeah, I think that's one of the mysteries of life that we're faced with.
Well, and hearing that Sufi saying, I mean, that's very resonant with Swedenborg said a very similar thing, that and for if in the biblical story, it's the Garden of Eden is this, it was all just given that everything was sacred and everything was speaking of God. But then over time, we needed the temple and the rules and the ritual to kind of keep us in line. And part of the vision that I perceive of the new church is to get to a place where we feel that sacredness again, we have the vibe again, and we have the language, and we have ways of talking about it. And the holy city is sort of the depiction of the garden is back in the center of the city, the holy city vision from Revelation. But now you have a city, you have a complex arrangement of people and environments, and I'm very interested in that. On one level, I mean, and you're an academic in religion. I mean, there's so many words we can use. There's so much language. There's so much, and it's all so beautiful. In your experience, do you find moments where you have the words and the vibe, like where both sort of come together, and there's a real sense of not just speaking about something in a dry way, but kind of feeling the energy or the life of it? Does that emerge for you in your academic work or your time in spiritual community?
Yeah, when you say that, it makes me think of, I'm paraphrasing, but there's a tradition in Christianity and Islam, something to the effect of like, when multiple people come together to remember my name, then I'm present with you. And there's an Islamic saying that, yeah, when multiple people come to remember God, then the angels come close. And so I do feel like there's a place for individual contemplation and having time alone and spaciousness, and that's helpful. But, when I think about, our time together at Almont and just like having all the people together, it just creates its own special kind of vibe. And I think that happens with any number of spiritual communities. One intersection that I think of is there's an academic religion conference that I've been going to most years for the past like 15 years. It's called the American Academy of Religion, and it's like the big national academic religion conference. And on the one hand, it's a professional organization, and there's panels and networking and things like that. But on the other hand, and the bigger draw for me these days is it's like a family reunion of sorts, is that these are people that I've been growing with academically and spiritually and through friendship. And so to get to see each other every year, it's like really special and is a reminder of why I'm glad to be in the field that I am. And, we share meals together and just hang out. And especially as I advance more and more in my career, and there's less stakes in terms of like spending all of my time networking and trying to, climb the rungs or whatever. And I do that also. But yeah, just being around like-minded people, even interviews like this, I feel like it creates something really special that's hard to do on an individual level. Is that getting at kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly concur. There's something about when we care about something that's similar. We have a shared concern, and then to have that friendship and that relationship. And I mean, and I wonder where competition runs in. You brought in the kind of climbing the rungs. To me, it's when competition is a part of it, that can really fray it, or a sense of argumentativeness.
Mm-hmm.
Versus shared learning and offering new perspectives. Those are some of my thoughts. Do you have a sense of the opposite of sort of what really harshes the vibe in terms of creating that? And, what are the things that get in the way? Have you had those experiences as well?
Sure. I think it goes back to something I was saying earlier, is that there's like lovely people all over the world, and, people that are not, I mean, maybe everybody's got some loveliness inside them, but they don't always manifest it. And so, I think with various professions, and maybe academia is emblematic in a way because it has a facade of hierarchy and meritocracy, even though it's often very nepotistic and who knows who and shady in all sorts of ways. My experience has been that, like my colleagues who are on similar levels, and as I was grad students, so there's a sense of collegiality and that like we're all on the same team. And then there's the people that might hold more of the power, who are often very supportive, but could also come across as adversarial and gatekeepers of sorts. And so I think, like many professions, the sense of hierarchy can get to people's heads in ways that I think goes against the spirit of like the bigger picture, which is to learn and to educate and to disseminate knowledge. But I feel like that's like a human experience as well. And that's, Jesus was dealing with that as well. And people are like obsessing over rules and you got to do it this way and you got to do it this way. And he's like, no, you're missing the point. There's these rules, but there's an underlying spirit. And like, that's the most important thing to focus on. And in a professional world, I guess that's easy enough to say, but when your job and career is on the line, you can't just be like Jesus and sort of tell everyone off and be like, you're wrong. So, but I think the larger principle is still kind of there.
That's interesting. And you think, I mean, obviously Jesus was, doing his thing and speaking against the hierarchy and the power structures. And then a whole nother community formed around his life that then had its own hierarchies and power structures. I mean, it almost is inevitable, that's just part of what it is to be a human being, and inevitable and maybe necessary. Do you think it's necessary? I do wonder how a purely, if a community was just totally living the vibe of Jesus, how that would be able to be carried forward over time. I don't know. What is your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of maybe various like company structures that might have some kind of noble mission, but then they have fiduciary responsibilities and there's hierarchies and, minimum wage laws and boards of trustees with different competing interests. And so I think that's part of human nature. And we can try to resist that in different sorts of productive ways. But I guess to me, it comes back to this idea of like, there's systems, you can try and work within the systems to create positive change in the systems, but sometimes the systems are broken and maybe you should just burn the systems down and start over again. And I think on a global and national level, we can see that in various ways where it's like, you can try to work within the system, but then the system is like, well, we're going to exert military force against you. So do your best to work within the system where we're pointing guns at you. And then it's like, well, how do you work within a system like that? And I wish I had a good answer to that. That as someone who's generally pacifist, it's like, what do you do when people are not pacifist and they're exerting their authority over you? And yeah, I think these are some of the questions that we're dealing with. Or when there's wars and genocides happening around the world and we're individuals and we can try and organize and try and educate the masses, and baby steps are hopefully worth something. But at the end of the day, when people have a lot of money and a lot of guns, it's hard to like push back against that. So sorry to get morbid quickly,
No,
but
it's a very intense time. And in my perspective, it's these questions of these mystical visions of why we're here and where we're headed actually are important right now, because it does feel, and even this question of is law necessary? It's like, well, it has been necessary. It has been necessary to maintain what has been. But I don't know, I'm very inspired by the statement you made about the Sufis and the vision I perceive in the revelation of just, it's not going so great. It's not going so great on this planet. It's not, our efforts to make a better world using these kind of law-based brains that are often not really feeling the vibe of love and not really open to the mystery and kind of wondering about the sacred calling. It does seem to me, and even, people like Albert Einstein and others have said, we need a new kind of consciousness to solve the problems that we created with our old consciousness. And it feels like it is that spirituality does have something to say. about how we might shift into living in a different way, living in a way that's more connected to that knowing that we're all one family, because so much of the suffering of the planet is this I'm going to push you down so that I can thrive, and we don't realize we're hurting ourselves, right? We're hurting our planet, our shared
And
family.
I think something that gives me some sort of optimism, and you can find polling on this, and the pessimistic polling creates a lot of polarization, and it's this group against that group, and they're diametrically opposed. But if you look at a lot more of the nuances, it's like, people mostly want the same things. People want their family to be safe, they want enough to eat, they want to be able to afford, medical expenses. They want to have hobbies. They want to have meaning. And when we just like dichotomize things into like Democrats and Republicans or pro-Trump and anti-Trump, then that serves to reify these dichotomies, which ends up benefiting the people that are in power, who it's in their best interest to stay in power, because then the people with less power are fighting with each other instead of the people that are actually trying to harm us. And I I guess that gives me some sliver of hope, in that, having conversations like this and having baby steps, or even being in college classrooms and having small community organizing, it can at least set the stage and help us to be less futile and depressed, so that we've got energy to, try to affect whatever change that we can, even if it's even so. That's my optimistic moment.
I have that same optimism, Elliot, that I mean I don't always have it every day, but it does feel to me like things are very hard right now and we're very aware of it. There are a lot of people that are actually more aware of the harm that we've done in the past and the suffering that's occurred, and that at the core, exactly, we all need life is actually not super duper complicated, right? We need to breathe and eat and sleep and wash ourselves and hopefully have a dry place to sleep at night, and we've added a lot of desires and possibilities of other things to do. But I do perceive right now that like a lot of the suffering that we're experiencing is really lack of basic things. I mean, you and I both make probably a pretty good living, and it's like still hard to get a doctor to see me, or it's like there's certain things that have become very complicated and difficult. We could just look to each other, and I do perceive that there are a lot of people that do feel that, recognize that, and are maybe even more than ever before, and maybe that's partly why the powers that be are becoming even more in their own fear of annihilation, becoming even more aggressive and dictatorial and insane. Doesn't take the scary stuff, but
Yeah. I I like to think that there's this YouTuber you might know of. His name's Mark Rober. He's a former NASA engineer, and he does a lot of silly YouTube videos where he'll make like squirrel mazes in his backyard, or he'll he'll set up fake Amazon packages, wouldn't wait for people to steal them, and then like a glitter bomb will go off. And so he does all sorts of silly things, but he does he does some like inspiring social experiments too. And one of the things that he did is he got hundreds of wallets, and put a few bucks in them and scattered them all across the country. And something, he had the address on it, asking people to return it if it was lost or something. And something like 85% of people returned the wallets. And I feel like stories like that, yeah, it's like hopeful. It's like, at the end of the day, if people are given the chance to do the right thing, then yeah, it's not scientific necessarily representative, but I feel like it's so easy to turn on the news and focus on the hyperpolarization. But then, even in like the classes that I teach, I've got like 30 students, and they're young college students, so they're probably left leaning on the whole, but I never ask them to divide themselves politically. But it's like, on the whole, people are like nice to each other and want to cooperate. And yeah, so it's kind of cool just when you give people the chance to just be regular and
Yeah.
not focus on all the hypersensitization.
Yeah. Well, there
Yeah.
almost seems like there's a parallel a little bit between the unity that we have in our humanity and then the all of the distinction that's created when we get into political parties or regions. And then a similar kind of thing is happening within religion, that there's this mystical unity kind of at the heart of a religious tradition. And then we start to feel sort of separated as we get to the practices or the identity. So it's just another part of that mystery of words. And we've created all these words, we've created all these identities, and it's cool and it's separating. And so how to I don't know, how to find the vibe again, how to find the vibe again, even with all of the different identities. And I think about this in religious communities, because often what happens, like if you go to a religious service, you enter that space, and in some ways you sort of set your identity aside. Usually there's practices of, you come into your pew and now you're doing this, and you're not talking about politics, and you're not, you're receiving something or you're participating in a certain way. And there's something very beautiful about that. And can you go into that space and then also have all of those identities thing happening in the midst of it all? All right. Well, we have been talking a lot today, Elliott. We've been in this call because of technology.
Yeah.
But what came to mind as maybe a place to bring it all together before we say goodbye is, I'm thinking of your grandmother again. I'm thinking of her identity as an agnostic atheist, Swedenborgian, and this question of words and identity and the vibe. What are your thoughts for yourself personally, maybe, and maybe at this time in history, on what are some helpful ways to hold identity?
Yeah. I mean, it's something I've thought a lot about in terms of being raised in an atheist agnostic household and then converting to Islam and then starting college where there's the world religions sort of paradigm with all sorts of motley crew of people that want to study religion in college. One of the things I've thought about is that I converted to Islam when I was 18, and I was atheist agnostic until then. And so I sort of have like a foot in both worlds. And then, being involved in Swedenborgian things to a certain extent. I work at a Catholic school, and so I attend Catholic education conferences and things like that. And then all that just sort of forms a hodgepodge of, I think I have like an eclectic sort of spiritual worldview. So that's sort of where I am. I feel like I've got a foot in a lot of different worlds, and I try to embrace it all and just like be authentic in terms of how I present myself and all the answers that I don't know, but it keeps me curious.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people on the planet who are walking that walk of eclectic influences and interests. And I'm curious where it's all leading, because sometimes I think there's this question of, well, what do you do with is there going to be a new identity that's formed that can hold all of the different disparateness? But I don't know. I don't know what's being created, but so many of us, we have so many influences and so many areas of interest, and we all need to eat and we all need to sleep. We all need the basic things.
Yeah.
It's interesting times, my friend.
Interesting times indeed.
Interesting times to be on the planet, to be walking in this path of love. I hope you have many experiences of feeling the vibe in the days and weeks and months and years ahead for you.
Yeah, thanks
for this conversation.
Likewise. I appreciate it. It's fun to connect with folks.
When we both are in the sea.